Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Salguero, and today I will be presenting a longitudinal study of best practices in CS1. A prior study that looked at pure instruction, media computation, and pair programming best practices in a CS1 course were shown to reduce failure rates and improve one-year retention in the computer science major. Today, we will revisit these findings in this longitudinal study involving just under 6,000 students across 12 years. Not only did we see these benefits persist, but we also saw this larger group of students do as well as before in follow-on computer science courses. First, let us look back at 2008 for context as to why a course redesign of CS1 with best practices was even considered. The CS community was working on how to handle the decline in computer science majors after seeing a rise during the dot-com boom of the 1990s. This decline created the need and desire among institutions to find ways to attract and retain students into the major, especially those from underrepresented groups, such as women and minorities. This goal led to the redesign of our CS1 course to include a set of research-based best practices in order to appeal to more students. Many of you in the audience are familiar with each of these best practices, but allow me to review them briefly. First, peer instruction. Peer instruction is a multi-step teaching process that can be used to structure an in-class lecture and learning environment. At its core is asking students to solve questions in class. For each question, they answer it individually, discuss with groups, answer again, and then participate in a class-wide discussion. Peer instruction has been shown to have a variety of different benefits, from promoting active student engagement, reducing failure rates, and improving student learning. Media computation is a teaching curriculum for computer science that focuses on teaching concepts through the manipulation of images and sounds. The outlet for creativity through media computation is one of its appeals, as it allows students to express themselves in their computer science work while still learning about its concepts. It has been shown to have a variety of benefits, from reducing failure rates and improving motivation of students for computing, especially among women and non-majors. And finally, pair programming, which is a style of co-op programming where two students alternate between two roles, the driver and the navigator. The driver is responsible for writing code and controlling the mouse and keyboard. The navigator is responsible for providing guidance and suggestions to the driver on what to code. Pair programming has shown to increase retention of women in computing and increase student enjoyment and satisfaction in the course. Now we will look at the two courses that were the focus of our study. At UC San Diego, there are two paths into the CS major. The first path, which is designed for students with no prior CS experience, is composed of two courses. The first course in this path, CS1 MPE, was the course that was redesigned with the best practices in fall of 2008. The second path, which is designed for students with prior CS experience, is a single course called CS1 PE, which experienced no change throughout the time focused on in this study. Both paths cover the same CS topics and are gateways to future CS courses. The courses in gold were the ones we focused on in this study. For the rest of this talk, I will be referring to these courses as CS1 NPE for no prior experience and CS1 PE for prior experience. This alternative path through the major is valuable, as it affords us a second comparison group for this study. The first comparison is looking at outcomes for students before and after the adoption of best practices. The second is comparing what happened in the CS1 NPE class against what happened in the CS1 PE class over the same time period. As our longitudinal study examines outcomes for students across a 12-year period, we had large sample sizes in the thousands per course and per time period. Please note that the populations differ between the two courses slightly, as the CS1 NPE course has more students from underrepresented groups and slightly fewer CS majors. Our study focused on the following 5 metrics: fail rate, retention rate in the major, switch rate into the major, upper division GPA, and time to degree. For the sake of time, I will only be focusing on a subset of these metrics, but please refer to the paper for more in-depth results on all 5. Let us look now at how the introduction of best practices into CS1 NP impacted the 5 metrics for all students. Overall, the average fail rate was halved, which supports an earlier finding from a study implementing best practices in a CS1 course. More students were retained in the major through graduation on average in the best practices timeframe, and we also saw an increase in students switching into the major. These findings are incredibly promising for the course redesign effect on students. For these metrics, relative risk was used to measure effect size. For those who may be unfamiliar with relative risk, the relative risk, for example, for fail rates, means that students who take the best practices version of the course have only 42% the risk of failing as students in the prior version. Here we look at the final 2 metrics. Upper division GPA increased as well in the best practices timeframe, but average time to degrees stayed the same at about 4.5 years in both timeframes. Effect size for these metrics were calculated using Cohen's d. For upper division GPA, the effect size we observed here is considered small. Although these results appeared promising, the question remained whether these improvements were being caused by changes in time. So were students in one time frame simply better students, or were they coming in more prepared? We originally looked into these effects in 2 different ways. The first way by comparing changes in CS1 NP and CS1 P across both timeframes. And the second way was by using regression models on CS1 NP data to see if the transition to best practices better explained the change in student outcomes over the time period. Let us look again at fail rates. We noticed there appeared to be a substantial drop after the introduction of best practices, which our regression models eventually did in fact confirm this assumption. Here we see similar graphs for retention rates, with increased retention for students in the best practices timeframe. We also saw increases for students in CS1P, the course with no redesign. Based on our regression models, we found that the presence of best practices improves student fail rates, retention, and upper division GPA. Our models did not find evidence that the best practices explain changes for the remaining 2 metrics. So far, best practices has improved student performance in certain metrics on whole. And next, we beg the question, how is this impacting our students from underrepresented groups? After all, getting more of these students into computer science and providing them with the skills and knowledge to succeed is of high priority for many of us, including myself. For the sake of time, we will only look into comparisons of fail rates and upper division GPA. We found that fail rates for non-URM students decreased across both courses and timeframes. However, the significant reduction for fail rates was for CS1 and PE. We see a different story for URMs because their fail rates were much higher for CS1 NP at the start, with over 40% of URMs failing the course. Fail rates for URM students were drastically decreased for CS1 NP, while they actually increased for CS1 PE. Similar to fail rates, upper division GPA among non-URM and URM students increased for CS1 and PE, although this increase for URMs is considerably larger than for non-URM. The key finding here was that URM students' outcomes improved for fail rates, switching into the major, and for their upper division GPA. Additionally, similar benefits were seen for non-URM students, and non-URM students also benefited from increased retention in the major. As such, although we've improved outcomes for URM students, the achievement gap between non-URM and URM students persists in most cases, and non-URM students continue to have better outcomes than URM students. You may also be asking, did we find similar results between men and women? And the answer is yes. Both groups benefited from the change to a similar degree. Further information on this can be found in the paper. You may also wonder whether the faculty teaching the courses played some role in affecting our results. Perhaps the instructors who were more inclined to teach using best practices were better teachers. Encouragingly, we saw that faculty who taught CS1 and PE with and without best practices saw similar benefits after the switch when it came to fail rates, retention, and rates of students switching into the major. Again, more information on this can be found in the paper. In our paper, we examined the change in student body over time and differences in instructors as potential threats to validity. Unfortunately, by combining best practices, we cannot distinguish which were responsible for the improved outcomes. To conclude, I would like to propose that now is the time for instructors to adopt evidence-based best practices. Our evidence shows that these practices have provided substantial benefit for students. Our work highlights the importance of addressing a number of key challenges going forward. The first is finding ways to help ease adoption of these practices for faculty. Furthermore, despite improvements, URM students are still twice as likely to fail their CS1 course. Although we do see a benefit among students as a whole, we need successful interventions to close the achievement gap. The key findings of our paper were that the switch to best practices improves student fail rates, retention, rates of switching into the major, and upper division GPA. These improvements appear to be tied to the switch to best practices rather than changes in students over time, as our regression models showed. Students from underrepresented groups benefited from the transition, but did so roughly proportionally to students from represented groups. And finally, faculty who switched to best practices saw improvements in their students' fail rates, retention rates, and switch rates into the major. I would like to thank the NSF for providing funding and our many collaborators who have helped with peer instruction, media computation, and pair programming at UCSD and beyond. Thank you.